How can landholders and farmers benefit? How can our landscapes and environment benefit? I'd like you to please welcome Dr. Shane Norrish, the Landcare Australia CEO, who is going to introduce and facilitate this morning's panel. Thanks, Shane.
Thanks very much, Costa. Thanks very much, everybody, and good morning. And I'd like to thank you particularly for taking an interest in this panel titled Emerging Environmental Markets. I have the privilege of leading Landcare Australia, responsible for coordinating the conference and awards. And part of, obviously, the area that Landcare is interested in is our role bridging agriculture and conservation. And the title of this panel session really reflects, I think, the evolution in that space. And it's really driven by the increasing interest in the new market opportunities for farmers and other land managers, including traditional custodians, to recognise and reward good land management practices that deliver multiple benefits for the wider community. The increased interest has been predominantly driven by the evolution of the carbon markets, which is really, I guess, the most mature and well-regulated. However, biodiversity and protection of natural areas is also emerging as a potentially important market and is often a highly valued co-benefit or seen as a co-benefit of the carbon markets. We've got the privilege of having an outstanding group of panellists this morning, and I'd just like to introduce you to them. The first to my right is Rowan Foley. Rowan comes from the Wandunna clan of the Budgella people, traditional owners of the Fraser Island and Hervey Bay area of Queensland. Rowan is the CEO of the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation, a not-for-profit entity that has offices in Cairns, Sydney and Alice Springs. Rowan has worked on land management in the NT and the Kimberley since 1989, and amongst his achievements has negotiated the first Indigenous protected area in Western Australia. The Aboriginal Carbon Fund was recognised in the inaugural list of 100 green power players published in The Australian recently, and he currently is based in the Alice Springs area of the Territory and lives there with his family, dogs and horses. The next of our panellists to my right is Adrian Ward. Adrian has more than 15 years' experience in the private and public sectors in managing business and providing advice, training centred on environmental markets and natural capital, both focused on Australia and internationally. We then have Peter Anderson, who is a director of Sweet Cane, a sugarcane farming business based at Tully in far north Queensland. Sweet Cane has owned and operated an aggregation of cane farms for the past 16 years. It sends about 45,000 tonnes of cane to Tully Mill. Peter also has a background in the agribusiness sector, in particularly agricultural banking, having been with Rabobank for more than 20 years in investment and advisory. And finally, I'd like to introduce Ben Keogh. He's the Managing Director of Australian Carbon Traders and has been active in the carbon market since its very earliest days. As a member of the Carbon Farming Initiative Advisory Group, Ben had direct input into the development of the Carbon Farming Initiative sequestration project scheme, and he was a major contributor to the human-induced regeneration methodology, which is one of the most important methodologies for farmers to access the carbon market. And he has a detailed understanding of the workings of that methodology, its determination, and how the market works. Our intention today is to provide some practical advice on entry and consideration of how to participate in the carbon market and also to look at some of the risks. I'd just like to start with some pretty basic practical examples based on long experience. And I'll go to you first if I can, please, Ben. As we've just outlined, you've been involved in the carbon market for an extended period of time, and you've worked very closely with government and many Landcare groups and individuals over that time. What changes have you seen in recent days that has really resulted in an easier pathway for farmers to participate in the market?
Yeah, thanks, Shane, and welcome everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and speak about the emerging carbon market. I noticed that you mentioned it was one of the more mature ones, but I think it's still in its infancy, personally. Over the last few years, really, they're trying to break down a lot of the barriers to entry. There's a lot of regulation about how you enter into a market and how you participate in the market, but I guess over the particular last sort of 5 or 6 years, we've seen a maturing of the market participants and a greater increase in the amount of knowledge that landholder groups have out there, which is starting to demystify the process a little bit. There's also been a concerted effort by the Clean Energy Regulator to provide greater detail or granular assistance to individuals or individual projects, particularly through the development of things like online tools, online registration, which is very good in some areas, but when you don't have internet, it's a lot more difficult, or poor internet. The other thing that's probably the increase in technology, things like the Sentinel satellite system that's gone up, that's made a big difference in how we do remote sensing, which means we can do less on the ground. And also the competence of a lot of the market participants. They've been doing this for a number of years now, so they're a lot more efficient at doing it and probably make a lot less mistakes. On the other side of that, we have new rules and regulations that we didn't have in the past, but it is certainly easier to get into the market now than it was 5 or 6 years ago, and particularly 10 years ago. So,
yeah, absolutely. And look, when I think about the landscape in which farmers operate, it's typically really complex. Farming businesses are complex these days. And we know that there's a whole heap of decision points. And I guess that, you know, you've got a pretty deep understanding of the market and particularly the land sector vegetation methodologies. When talking with farmers, what are some of the most important considerations that you think land managers, farmers need to understand, and what are their key interests that in your discussions when considering entering the market?
The first thing and where we started our business was essentially prosecuting the business case. That the farmers are businesses and we need to keep sustainable farmers on sustainable land. So when it comes to looking at what land use you can use for that area or that parcel of land, you need to make sure that the carbon farming, and remember it is carbon and farming, not carbon or farming, is that the administrative burden you're going to pick up, for one, is going to be there, that you need to be able to manage that, or if you don't manage it, you're going to pay someone to do it. The other consideration is this the right land use for that land? And to me, a lot of it starts very early with a whole farm plan, and then you can identify areas that would be best suited. Then you have to go through the process of actually saying, well, is this the right land use long term? Is this the right land use? Is this the financial benefit to me going to be there? Is this going to help me stay on the farm? Is this going to help the farm produce the environmental services that I need? Is it going to stop erosion, etc.? And how do I maximise my benefit from that? I mean, anyone can just go out and plant a paddock to trees, but it may not be the best outcome. So you need to actually go through the process, and it's been a bit difficult at times to find the right information. Because people in the past haven't, or groups and organisations have generally focused purely on carbon, that these are the returns you'll get for the carbon, but it doesn't really take into account what other gross margins you might be losing, whether you're taking cattle off, sheep off, taking out a crop, or what it might be. And possibly the biggest issue that you find is the uncertainty because of this policy-driven environment or policy-driven market that we exist in. I don't know if you saw what happened to the carbon prices, but they went from $50 to $25 pretty much overnight because of the decision by a now, thankfully, ex-minister. So understanding those inherent risks and understanding what's the best fit for you, what might be a good fit for a 25-year-old farmer starting out may not be the best fit for an 80-year-old farmer who's probably not looking at 25 to 100-year agreements. So the biggest issue is finding the right information that is actually relevant to you and your situation, and not just taking a cookie cutter approach to everybody. So,
yeah, thanks, Ben. Look, that cliff face impact on the carbon price was shown in Mark Howden's talk just yesterday, and I guess that's the part of the potential volatility around some of the elements of the market that we're starting to get to grips with. I'd just like to turn our attention to a completely different area now, if we could, and that, Peter, if I could just go to you. you've been involved in developing a new concept, an innovative approach to dealing with the protection of one of our most iconic natural assets, that being the Great Barrier Reef. And so your involvement with the Reef credit system has been aimed at designing ways to support protection mechanisms for farmers that are operating businesses that drain into the Barrier Reef Lagoon. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the Reef credit systems and how you became involved?
Sure, Shane. Briefly, the Reef credit system was established to financially reward farmers for changing their management practices to reduce their impact on the waterways around their farms and ultimately that lead to the Great Barrier Reef. So that was the concept behind it. To date, the two main projects have been around nitrogen loss and sediment loss. We're involved in the nitrogen loss side of things, and on that project, the measurement, Reef credit is the equivalent of 1 kilogram of DIN, dissolved inorganic nitrogen. So for every kilogram of DIN that we can stop leaving the farm and flowing into the waterways means we earn a 1 Reef credit. How did we get involved? Our neighbours were heavily involved with Green Collar in 4 or 5 years ago in putting this concept together. We came in on their coattails a little. Thanks to their introduction, we became involved towards the end of that initial phase on working through agreements, grower agreements and things like that. And at the moment, we've just had 2 lots of Reef credits issued, which are issued annually, and we're just about, I think this month, to line up for the 3rd set of issuing of Reef credits. So, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Look, it's clear that Reef credits are all about, really, it's a reward system for good farming practice. And I know that there's no shortage of farmers that are operating country within that Great Barrier Reef catchment. How are they being encouraged to participate? How are they, being really supported to start considering what they can get, how they can get involved?
Well, to date, I think it's been the drive from Green Collar. Right. So whether it's through workshops or field days or any opportunity to present what they're doing and how it works and all that type of thing. Their website, of course. They've also used growers who have started on the Reef credit journey like ourselves to be talking proactively about it and sharing our experience, which to date's been really good. So, yeah, to date it's been driven by them, and I think as more credits are issued and more people are involved, it'll gain momentum and not unlike the carbon stuff.
Thanks, Peter. Rowan, I'll just pick up on that same thread about markets alternative to the standard carbon market. Now, you've been involved in developing a new form of credits recognising cultural burning recently. What's involved in creating a new trading platform with a new product?
Oh, thanks, Shane. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to thank a lot of the people who acknowledge the traditional owners. And this morning was Shelley, and last night a number of the award winners acknowledged First Nations as well. And there's a number of talks over this conference about working together. I'd just like to say that whilst the acknowledgement of country is a wonderful thing and it's a very positive step forward, we need to move beyond the simple acknowledgement of country into the actual programs themselves. We need to move beyond the rhetoric. A good example of this is the State of the Environment report, where the author also mentioned the fact that we have Indigenous co-authors for the first time. So it's not just about consulting traditional owners, but it's actually about embedding First Nations knowledge into the actual program itself. And I think that's something that's rather missing at the moment. So we have the acknowledgement of country, we may have a traditional owner speaking, and then we go straight into the European models, the way that we've done things for the last 220 years in Australia. Embedding Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous programs in the actual activity is something that there's a lot of resistance to. So around cultural fire in particular, where people will say we acknowledge the traditional owners and now we're going to put in a hazard reduction burn. We've consulted with the traditional owners, we have a couple of Aboriginal rangers, and now we're going to use the European model of burning. And you just go, but hang on, like they just told you that doesn't quite work. And I said, no, we've been doing the European burning for 220 years, and that's the way we're going to continue. We've given the acknowledgement of country, we've employed a couple of Aboriginal rangers, and now we're going to burn the way the whitefellas have been burning this country for the last 220 years. And it's that part of the program that we're starting to shift. So cultural fire credits means that traditional owners have the cultural authority to burn that country. They'll be leading the burns in collaboration with the local RFS, the local farmers, the local landholders, but it's a completely different way of operating. So when I say we need to move beyond the rhetoric, move beyond the welcome to country, it's about the actual program itself. We've started to see that with the State of the Environment report, where we have Indigenous co-authors, and my chair, Barry Hunter, was actually one of those Indigenous co-authors. And it's actually embedding it into the actual program itself. And that's where we still have a lot of resistance, where people will say, look, we acknowledge the traditional owners, but we'll be burning the way that the white man burns. Now, through cultural fire credits, there's a mechanism where the traditional owners can be actively engaged and supported to burn with cultural authority the way that the First Nations burn in that particular area. So we're modifying the markets to bring it back to the way things should be. We're not letting the markets dictate what they want it to be. We're saying, no, this is the way it should be, and then we've built a market around that. And so it's a different approach. Takes a lot of thought, a lot of time, a lot of energy, but that's what we've done.
Thanks, Rowan. Obviously a wonderful initiative, and look, in our discussions, you've introduced, I guess, a different perspective on this concept of benefits, core versus co-benefits. And I just like you to expand, if you could please, on your thinking around, have we got it right?
Yeah, so we refer to them as core benefits, environmental, social and cultural core benefits. They're our drivers. That's what we do. That's what we do in carbon farming. We don't talk about carbon credits, we don't talk about money, we talk about achieving environmental, social and cultural outcomes. Whitefellas and blackfellas, farmer credits, community credits. That's our core values, that's our core drivers. That's our flour, egg and water. That's to bake the cake. That's our fundamental ingredients. Once we bake the cake, once we get that right, then you say, okay, well, what can we do next? Let's put some icing on the cake. That's the carbon credit. That's the co-benefit. Right? Everyone talks about the sugar hit. Everyone talks about the icing on the cake. And it's like, no, let's talk about baking the cake. That's the core benefit. So when you talk about co-benefits, what you're saying is that, mate, we're in it for the money, we're in it for the carbon credits, and if we happen to achieve a couple of these nice little fluffy environmental, social and cultural co-benefits along the way, great, but we're here for the money, we're here for the carbon. And these co-benefits are just ancillary to our driver, which is carbon and money. And we reject that. We say, no, that's the wrong way of going about it. Our philosophy is that if you're in the carbon game to make money or to generate carbon credits, you're doing it wrong. If you're in the carbon game to achieve environmental, social and cultural outcomes, you're doing it right. And if you do those things, the carbon credit will come along. You know, so so everyone, you know, yeah, so that's, you know, that's what we do.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think that's pretty consistent with the attitude of the majority of people participating in Landcare, where the core focus is on the biodiversity and social outcomes, with the revenue that can be achieved through that as being ancillary. And so thank you for that introduction. Adrian, if I could go to you, we've had a brief chat about reef credits, and we've had a brief chat about the new fire credits. And if we just think more broadly about biodiversity, I guess, and look, the World Economic Forum ranks biodiversity loss as one of the most significant global risks facing us in coming years. And we've just heard Ian Creswell talk about, and the Minister talk about the imperative for some urgent action in response to the State of the Environment report. And private landholders and land carers can be a big part of the contribution to turning that around. As CEO of Accounting for Nature, can you just give us, please, a little bit of a handle on your organisations, your objectives and what you offer?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Shane. So Accounting for Nature started about 15 or so years ago. That's the genesis was, or the big theory of change, or the thing we wanted to accomplish was to put the trend in environmental condition next to GDP. So when we say that GDP had gone up by 3%, we could also say that the environment had improved by 3%. And we figured that would be a no-brainer. The government would do it, no worries, and then it'll be on the headline of the Australian every day in the top right-hand corner. Unfortunately, I haven't quite transpired by that, but that idea for a common environmental accounting framework where you can show trend over time, well, ideally nationally, but through the NRMs at least, and right down to the property scale was the vision for the organisation. It was championed through fantastic people such as Professor Tim Flannery, Peter Cozier, and various others who you might know through the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists at the time. Fast forward 10 or so, 15 years later of lobbying efforts and whatnot, and we decided, well, we weren't really getting anywhere because of various factors. So what we thought was we would spin it out as a not-for-profit 3 years ago and build basically a movement from the bottom up with Landcare groups and NRMs and state governments, and more recently, private sector, who have become very interested in saying that they are climate positive, or whatever it might be. Saying they're nature positive off the back of climate positive. So globally at the moment, there's a huge interest in this whole area around nature risk and nature positivity and nature disclosure. And that is driven by some of the world's biggest companies. And Accounting for Nature, as it's currently positioned, is a really asset or regionally focused, property versus regionally focused accounting framework, a common accounting framework for measuring change in environmental condition over time. And so the idea is that we just accredit the science, right? We don't actually say whether a farm is sustainable or not. People pick it up, they use it, they put their own knowledge into it, science into it, it gets accredited, and then they use that to make a claim in the market and a benefit. So, for example, one of our most fantastic board members, Nadia Campbell from Gundicum, has recently just published her environmental account yesterday, and she's using that for various purposes, selling into markets in Europe under new European disclosure laws. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have the likes of AACO, the Queensland Government, and various others, basically using Accounting for Nature as the standard to provide a line of evidence that what you're doing is not greenwash. That's effectively it. And it's about trust and credibility at the end of the day.
So trust and assurance are a big part of it.
Absolutely.
And obviously you've connected with some fairly substantial entities in the organisations that you've been working with, but you've also been working with hundreds of landholders right around the country in various workshops and other formats. And Okay, I guess I'd be interested to hear what are some of the most common issues that are raised. What are the things that farmers are most interested in when you're talking about this concept of managing biodiversity, having an assurance that you're having a positive pathway going forward as a potential obligation to meet a revenue stream or a credit generation stream?
Everyone wants to know how much they're going to make out of it. That's always the first question.
Yeah.
Second question is how much does it cost to do? Some of those costs of measurement and monitoring we're trying to solve with technology and better methods, as we've had the opportunity to develop with Landcare and test across quite a number of groups in the last few months, which is fantastic. But what can you gain? And I think carbon markets, having been in carbon markets for quite some time now, as these guys will all tell you, I mean, it is quite complex to get an ACCU, Australian Carbon Credit Unit, particularly if you're a farmer somewhere out there and you go, wow, it's going to cost me, there's legal obligations, there's cost. So accessing carbon markets really needs the expertise of these gentlemen and also being involved as a Landcare group or NRM or whatever, it's a coalition to actually get those things going. But the other definition of environmental markets, of course, is not just tradable instruments. It's actually just about a premium that you can get for your products and that you're saying, hey, it's a sustainable farm, sustainable beef, I'm selling it and I can actually prove it. And so accounting for nature is that line of evidence to prove that. It can be used also for carbon markets to help with, Cobenefits and whatever you want to call them. But at the end of the day, we work with a very wide variety of organisations, big and small, who are defining their own environmental markets, whatever that might be, and finding premiums in really innovative ways, whether that's through their local IGA, selling into Europe, plugging into their help reef credits and whatnot, and all this sort of stuff that's going on. And so you don't actually have to engage in carbon markets. If you do, you're going to get rewarded for it because the prices are amazing and going to keep going up and up. Don't benefit otherwise. Well, they will keep going up, but the level of complexity is a big barrier for that. So just think very broadly about this term environmental markets. But at the end of the day, accounting for nature is just about credible metrics to prove what you're doing, and bringing integrity to the market, and that's really all we're about.
And you've seen a lot of Landcare group interest in the program, in the workshops and participation of that type. Yeah,
absolutely.
Peter, if I could just go back to you, I mean, a market is all about supply and demand. Who's buying the reef credits?
I think when they were originally envisaged, it was a mix of business, government, investors, philanthropists. I think it was a broad range. Initially, what we found is it's probably initially business and government that's driving it. Our initial reef credits were purchased by HSBC and the Queensland Government. But I think there's certainly hasn't been an issue with demand for them. Supply's probably been the bigger issue. And I think as more come online and available, we'll see that group broaden. But yeah, today it's been driven by a mix of business and government.
Do you see one day, or it's even probably happening now, that consumers can be an influence in the growth of that market?
I think like everything, consumers are going to drive lots of things, you bet. I'm not so sure about them being a direct buyer of credits, but certainly influencing businesses they deal with. I think they'll play a really important part. I think, we've seen it in the past where airlines will offer carbon offsets and things like that. Well, we may well see a similar thing in reef credits. I think some main future users might be people that use the reef, so shipping lines that travel up and down the channels that adjoin the reef, or tourism operators that use the reef. Or I think there's lots of potential for sure. I think the constraint initially is supply, but hopefully that'll change over time. Yeah,
great, thanks. Look, I mean, it's great to see that there's an incentive growing for farmers to participate, and there's that greater awareness growing about their role in mitigating impacts on the reef. So
and could I just say quickly, following on from what Rowan said earlier, it's actually the cream. It's not the core driver of farming businesses. So, we're trying to be the most productive and efficient farm we can. To do that, we want to be BNP accredited. I think 40% of the cane area is. But what Reef credits will do is hopefully accelerate that accreditation and move to best practice because there's a financial incentive. But the industry's moving that way already as being fully accredited and doing the right thing as farmers. But what it might do is accelerate the timeframes. So it's a good point from Rowan.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And Rowan, if I could come back to you, you've obviously been involved in trading within the carbon market for a fairly long time. Who are the interested purchasers of credits coming from the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation?
Oh, there's a lot of companies that we deal with. IAG is the latest one that we have a partnership with. We used to offset the Commonwealth Bank. We have a lot of large companies that come to us for a whole range of reasons. And carbon neutrality is I'm not going to go through all of them, but is the fifth reason why they come to us. They come to us for all these other reasons. I'd just like to pick up on a point between compliance and integrity. Often in the, of late in the carbon market, the word integrity has been used, and there's a bit of confusion. When you go to Canberra and you get your carbon project ticked off by the Clean Energy Regulator, you have compliance. You have compliance as determined by the public servants in Canberra. Nothing more, nothing less. Integrity is something completely different. And to have integrity in a project is what what companies are really chasing, to be honest with you. They want to know that all the right things are being done, not just compliance with the regulator in Canberra. And that's often misunderstood. And look, part of integrity is collaboration. I'd just like to give a shout out to Ricky from Nailsma and from Victor from Fire Sticks Alliance. These are two organisations that we work with very closely. We all have a contribution to make, and we can all see the value of each other's work. Particularly Fire Sticks Alliance around cultural fire credits. That work's taken 3 years, a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of thought. The first 6 months we just talked around the philosophy of the work, which is the why. Why are you doing it? People are very good about what they're doing and where they're doing it, but they're not very good about why they're doing it, and actually going into that and talking about it for 6 months and really making sure that you've got your philosophy as your bedrock understood. And then you can go into what we're doing with the cultural burns and then where you're going with cultural authority and what traditional owned groups, and the rest all flows. But you really have to make sure your why are you doing this? Look, I'm gonna, look, Landcare wants to come into the carbon market. Okay, great. Why? Why, and this is the question you really need to, why do you want to be involved? Like, what's the driver here? And that takes a lot of thought. We know what you're going to do. You're going to do a carbon methodology. We know where you're going to do it. You're going to do it on a farm, more than likely. So we know the what and the where. What we need to figure out is the why, and then who do you collaborate with in doing that work? Now, Landcare, I think that you guys do have a very strong history of collaboration, which is to be commended. And, if you do come into the carbon game, I encourage you to continue that, because often money is a very strong influencer and it can corrupt you. And you have to hold true to your values and not let this other stuff get in the way. Carbon is the last thing that we talk about when we work with white farmers and black traditional owners on country. If people talk to me about carbon credits and making money, I say, mate, that's what we talk about. Literally, I will do a carbon trade in the last 5 minutes of the day just before I take the dog for a walk. I don't spend much time on it at all. I spend a lot of time on environmental, social and cultural values and everything else that we do. The actual carbon trading itself is a very, very small part of what we do. Yes, it's important. I need to make a dollar. We all need to make a dollar. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of the work that we do, I'd say it's probably about 2% of my actual time is spent on carbon trading. And it's the most boring thing we do.
Yeah, I can understand that. And I just picking up on your challenge or the query about the why, I just go to you, Ben, if I could. You've worked with Landcare and Landcarers for such a long time in this space, and you've got such a strong familiarity with the market. Pretty basic question: do you see the market, the carbon and environmental markets more broadly, being a good fit for Landcarers? And I'll just back that up with, on the basis of your experience, where do you see the key risks are? You touched on it earlier, but where are the really key risks that you see need to be considered?
All right. Well, firstly, do environmental markets have a role in this? Absolutely. How they're integrated and how they're brought into the mainstream is very difficult. Mm-hmm. At the moment, we have multiple. Rowan talks about having his core benefits, well, from a carbon trading point of view. Mm-hmm. Our core benefit is the production of carbon. Yep. That's what the businesses want to buy off us. Yep. If they don't want to buy the carbon, they'll go and see someone like Rowan or Peter. All right. So I've been through multiple organisations, starting off with someone in middle management who says, hey, we want to be carbon neutral or climate positive or something like that. Yep. All goes well. We do a lot of work. You've probably been through this position yourself, Shane. You get to the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. First question is, what does this do to my bottom line? All right. If you don't see any sort of improvement, I won't do it. At the moment, the regulations that are out there for companies to actually purchase carbon, those under the safeguard mechanism, are pretty weak. So most of the activity is really about the voluntary market. And that voluntary market is, as a CFO or a CEO, I need to make sure that what I do is for the benefit of the company, which is generally in sales. What can I do to say, you pick up my product or use my service over somebody else's? That point of difference at point of sale is critical. So so people who are purchasing the credits will look at it and say, well, what are those, what marketing can I hang off this? What are the benefits? And at the moment, we've got a situation where we have lots of different types of credits coming onto the market. And I'll just state that carbon credits are the only one that is actually a regulated financial product. All the other ones can be created by anybody they like. Not saying there's no integrity in them, but anyone can create them and market them. What we need in the carbon market, if you want us to bolt on those ancillary benefits or those co-benefits, then we need a pretty clear set standard of what it is. And if it wasn't for the people, the work of the people sitting next to me, we would never get to that point. So what we need to do is come to these standards that can be audited, can be verified, so that we can actually say, yes, it is a carbon project, and these are the additional benefits. So there has to be sort of the integration of a number of these markets at some point. Part of the reason is that landholders have been regulated to look after their land by governments and organisations for a long time. This is the opportunity to be finally paid for what you're doing. You're dealing with the externalities of the city, right? All the heavy lifting that's been done in reducing emissions in Australia has been done by the land sector so far, and you haven't been paid for it. Every other type of emission has gone up except for land use change, forestry. So when you want to start to talking about the risks, about what are going into this, it is really because it's such an infancy, in its infancy, and we don't have those real standards. The market already does do a little bit of this sort of premium thing. So if you're selling HAI credits, you probably get $3 or $4 more than you would get over a landfill gas. If you're doing savanna burning, that's got again, because it is inherently has that First Nations component to it, you'll get a little bit more as well. So the market actually starts to feel this out and starts to appropriate it itself and putting things where they go. The biggest risk is the lack of transparency in the market at the moment, and the lack of cohesion in the market, and the lack of fungibility. If you're getting $80 a tonne overseas in New Zealand, you're only getting 25 in Australia. I ask you why. The atmosphere doesn't give a damn about borders. So why are we getting such vastly different prices for essentially if a tonne is a tonne is a tonne? So when it comes back to that risk is not knowing what your future prices are going to be and what your future obligations are going to be is probably one of the big ones. But they are starting to filter out now, and we're starting to get to some sort of a little bit more stability in the market. But again, it is a policy-driven market at this stage. Until it's mainstream, we have to see what happens with the review of the safeguard mechanism. We have to see what happens with the Ian Chubb's review. We've had the King report come out recently. We've had a change in government. We've got the independents now there is just two things the market cannot stand: uncertainty and opaqueness. And we have them in spades at the moment.
Thanks, Ben. Look, we could pursue this discussion for substantially longer, and I guess just to pick up on your point, one of the things that's so critical, of course, is information, and I would suggest that Landcare is well placed to provide credible and valid, and ideally impartial information.
And trusted.
That's right. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there. There are a whole range of areas that we could continue this discussion on, and I'm sorry that we've had to just brief it a little, but if anybody would like to follow up with yourselves through the remainder of the day, I'm hoping that you'd be very happy to have those chats, and I just encourage anybody in the audience who wants to pursue some of the matters that have been discussed within the new environmental markets that are being developed to connect with yourselves. And I'd very much like to thank you for joining us this morning. Really appreciated your experience and insights, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. So thanks all.
Thanks, Shane.
Thank you, Shane.
Thanks, guys.
Well done.